the talk we just heard about the Iran, during the time, so difficult time you all went through, and I understand that, did the artists and art-loving people come up and express their art on the walls or on the roadside or other areas? Were there restrictions that you couldn't do that?
Sorry, was it for me?
This is for Nusha.
Okay, so the question was about during the period when photographers couldn't go out on the street, did people put stuff up on the walls?
The galleries.
And graffiti and I think.
No, but very few graffiti because everything.
Speak into the microphone.
Sorry, everything outside for almost couple of 6 months was really difficult, and many young people who were active in a field of art, they felt depressed themselves. So it was not like immediately they could act. So it took some time for them to find themselves again, and because they had so much hope, and suddenly everything was ruined for them. So it was quite a very sensitive time, and also the government, they were really, really sensitive towards galleries and any activities with artists. So everybody were really careful.
Another? Yes, we can find. You'll get there.
I'm Shreve Simpson. My question is prompted by the first paper, and it has to do, but it could perhaps apply more broadly. It has to do with the notion of masterpiece. And in your opening remarks, Your Highness, you mentioned that artists create in order to fulfill their function, their purpose of worshiping God. So there's a long etymology of the word masterpiece in various languages, and I'm wondering whether or not artists in the Islamic world, both in traditional periods and contemporary times, modern times and contemporary times, so this is why perhaps it could be applied to all the presentations, whether or not the idea of something outstanding, which is an adjective used to mean masterpiece and or to apply to masterpiece, and is one of the adjectives you used in your opening remarks, whether or not the idea of masterpiece is something that Islamic artists themselves would use to refer to their production.
Okay. Can you do it?
Actually, in Islamic art, you're talking of pure Islamic art. There isn't one masterpiece. Every work should be a masterpiece, every work of art. Because like I said, in Islamic aesthetics, God is beautiful and He loves beauty. Inna Allah jameel wa yuhibbul jamal. And there are other also in the Quran sentences to talk about aesthetics and beauty. So to create something that is less than what the artist believes should be didn't exist at the time. And there was no graffiti art, there was no poster art, there were always masterpieces. If we look at the works, at the miniatures, at the decorations on the walls of mosques, at the, like I showed, the Islamic lamp, and the kaftan, the Ottoman kaftan, and etc. So masterpiece was, like we say in Arabic, tahsil hasil. We say it is something that should be. It's not something that I create one masterpiece throughout my lifetime and everybody should fall on their knees in front of it. Okay? Does that answer your question?
Is there a particular term in Arabic, for instance, you just referred to that might refer to as masterpiece?
No, there isn't.
Another question? Here we have. Yes, if you wait for the mic.
So I apologize in advance. This is kind of long-winded, but good afternoon. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I've been looking forward to this symposium since I started school. So I am a first-year ceramic grad student at VCU. My life-size realistic figure work stems from my background and experience as a Lebanese American moving between two worlds, and more recently my research into Orientalism and the images produced by Orientalist painters. I layer my figures and the environments in which they are set with the exquisite detail and attention to patterning that the West was so attracted to. So a combination of the detail and the physical appearance and dress of my figures leads my predominantly Western viewing group right now to make assumptions about my identity and the identity of my subjects. These assumptions are that I am Muslim, and so are the subjects I am representing, when in fact, all of my subjects and myself are Druze, a small religion found mostly in Lebanon and Syria, and a religion that has commonalities with Islam, especially the culture it produces that has such an emphasis on family, generosity, and selflessness. And it's this culture that I'm attempting to represent in my work. So, based on some of the definitions of Islamic art that some of our speakers mentioned, I'm left to wonder what I would be classified as, and if you think it is important that I be aware of this classification, and if there is a need for, or at least in my case, this distinction between Islamic art and Arab art in present society.
Who would like to take it? Were you directing it at anyone in particular?
All right, I'll do it.
One for the team.
Well, I mean, here's the thing about definitions. Definitions, categorizations, I mean, they are a necessary evil in certain ways because we need to talk about things. And so, you know, we need to classify and we need to categorize them. We're all aware that art history canon created these categories that are not perfect. And we, in fact, many of us who come from different parts and now we are part of the Western culture are trying to unpack and, you know, and change. So your question about how you would be classified would vary depending on who's classifying you or where they're putting you. I think the thing we need to do is understand that these definitions are needed, but we need to understand also that they are not so rigid, that they could be fluent, that we could, in fact, maybe it is in fact time for us now to stop talking about bridging East and West, stop talking about the West and the East as two different things. We talk about the global age, yet at the same time, we still sort of stick to identity politics. Identity is important. It's never going to go away. As a matter of fact, the global age showed us that, if anything, it's back. And sometimes it's back with vengeances. But also, at certain times, for people who come from the so-called previously Islamic world, identity is not just about a place. It's also about a position. And so maybe it's not something that could be abandoned yet. But what we need to do with identity is unpack it, recontextualize it in a way that makes sense to us, to you as the artists who are doing it. Declare it. Don't wait for someone to classify you. Art historians will do that, but you know, everyone will do that based on their practice and their training. But you know, we just need to sort of get over our obsession and sensitivity towards notions of identity. We can't lose it. We just need to live with it. We need to figure out how to live with it at best. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Someone from this side? We have one question right here. Yeah.
Ms. Tavakolian, I loved your portraits, your blank pages. You'd said it took you about 8 months to arrive at what you showed us. Maybe there are more, but they were so powerful and lovely and quiet. So I hope you will continue to do those and to represent the people whom most of us won't have an opportunity to meet or to know. So thank you for that. So I also wanted to ask you, One of the comments you made was that there were images that didn't survive or that had not yet revealed themselves. And I am particularly interested in history and wonder whether you know of any efforts to digitize or to like collect these old pieces, these old photographs for your museum that you will start.
Actually, it's a very interesting question because I was inspired to change the way I used to take pictures. I was a photojournalist. I was going all around the world taking pictures of disaster, wars, but in 2005, I had a chance to go to the treasury of Golestan Palace, where it's the most more than thousands, I don't know, like maybe 20,000 glass plates and images from the first, from Nasruddin Shah, the last Qajar king, who went to France and he was giving a camera. He fell in love with photography. He came back and he got obsession for taking pictures of everything that was around him. He had more than, I don't know, 50, 60, I don't know, maybe 100, sorry, I don't know exactly how many 100 wives he had. And a lot. And he photographed them nude. He photographed them nude. So Golestan Palace, it holds the most important collection of photography maybe in Middle East and the world. So they don't do much with it. So unfortunately, if you're lucky, you go and you see the glass plates. But they don't. They show some of them, but for some reason that I don't know. I think it's mismanagement. This is the reality we are facing. We're facing mismanagement there.
That may be, but it's critically important to protect and preserve those,
I know.
especially if they're on glass plates. And so maybe some university student or apprentice could take on a project of at least printing or
I know, we
capturing
tried.
that.
We tried so much. Like, for example, the glass plates that you see from 145 years ago, my great-great-uncle, I had to beg my cousin because he was talking about these glass plates. And when his grandmother died, they put the glass plates by the door, and we went overnight to the garbage. I found those glass plates. This is how we preserve, When I say photography museum, the serious one in Middle East, I'm talking about that. Archive it, print it, and take care of it for future.
Another question? Somewhere in the back, maybe?
No,
There's one here. Yeah, okay.
Hi, my question is, first I wanted to thank you all for your great talks. My question is towards Neda. I know you talked about traditions of contemporary art, and I wanted to know if you could talk about traditions of modern art. I think there's been a lot of looting in Iraq, not recently, but in the past, 1.5 decades. And and a lot of the works that are now coming and emerging that were not in Baghdad at the time are being sold to Doha, Abu Dhabi, Western museums, and they're no longer in Iraq. And I think for me, like personally, when I think of what's happening in Iraq with modern art, I think of Jawad Salim's sculpture that went missing. And then it was found in the middle of the street and bought for $100. Yeah. And it came back without a heart. So, and I think that's what that symbolism of a piece coming back without its heart is exactly what's happening with a lot of Iraqi art. And I wanted to know if you could talk about the state of modern art in Iraq and how we can preserve it, or if there is anything being done about it.
I mean, thank you for your question. I think we need a whole other symposium on that, to be honest. But I mean, you know, it's a bit more complicated and sort of references the notion of identity politics that I was talking about before. Because, I mean, we all know leading to the invasion, you know, Iraq was represented as the cradle of civilization, our humanities heritage, which did not include the 20th century because that's sort of national heritage. So there's already sort of that political tension there. In terms of for the Iraqis, modern art, you know, was part of their daily life. And so, in fact, you know, during the 90s, and the looting really started with the Gulf War, even before the invasion, they sold a lot of works to, you know, survive, because understanding that they were of value. That in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when there were exhibitions, people actually bought work and hung them in their houses. So the memory of that continues, and you know, it's not sort of something that would go away. It sort of is in the collective memory. Now, what to do about the looting of the works, and you know, this is very problematic on various levels. Yes, works were looted. Yes, works were sold, but also there is a lot of sort of rumors about who's buying and where did they go, like there are rumors in the Middle East about the fakes. And so, in my opinion, we really need an objective scientific way of knowing this, because just looking, I mean, I get contacted by people who want me to authenticate or evaluate, and I can't do that. That's, I mean, you know, in my eye, I'm not Superwoman, and my eye cannot discern, you know, if this is a fake or not. But also, I think we do a lot of disservice to the work if we keep sort of circulating the idea, these rumors about things being fake, because we're devaluing the arts. So there's that one thing, but also on the other hand, I mean, I've seen a lot of the looted work in various places. In all consciousness, I can't ask them to return it to Baghdad at the moment, because what will happen to it when it goes back to Baghdad? We've tried that, and that was not a good thing, not a successful thing. Many people do tell us that they have looted works, that they bought them for safekeeping. And I think, you know, yes, it's been a decade and a half, and would they ever go back to the museum? I don't know. But at the moment, I'm not sure there is a responsible entity in Baghdad. And that's probably going to get me in a lot of trouble, and no support from Baghdad after saying this. You're recording. But the reality is, you know, they don't have the infrastructure to care for it, nor to understand it. So it's a very complex situation.
We won't.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes? Does someone?
Hi. Thank you for a wonderful and informative day. My question is for Nassim. I was wondering if you could, I know this could be a topic of another whole lecture, if you could flesh out for us, what would it be like today for a younger Iranian who's interested in becoming, in creating films? Like, what would they have to go through? I think a lot of us from films in America and documentaries have an idea of how difficult it is in America for someone to, you know, get a start in the film industry, raise the funds necessary for a film. What's it like in Iran?
Well, the Iranian situation has been quite Can you hear me? Yeah. It has been quite complex. One of the paradoxes, the many paradoxes of the Islamic Revolution was the growth of Iranian cinema. The fact that there was censorship, that they were not allowed to import any foreign films, meant that there was all of a sudden a lot of resources thrown at local talents to come and produce a type of, and create films, and that in itself provided that platform for films to grow and for filmmakers to experiment without the concerns of money. Of course, that also meant they had to work within certain parameters, and they needed to have a permit at every stage of producing. And now, when I'm talking about this monitoring of film production in Iran, over the last almost 4 decades, it has been fluctuating depending on who is in power and how lax they're going to be with art production. There have been a number of developments, both globally and locally, that have influenced these, the ease with which, or difficulty with which, filmmakers can produce their work. One has been the spread of satellite dishes and the competition that the state now was faced with, and one which they didn't have much control over. And that in itself, I think, has really influenced the kind of relative kind of lifting of those very draconian measures of what can be depicted and what cannot be depicted. To give you an example, close-ups of women in the 80s were not allowed. That would be a laughing matter right now in Iran if that were to be discussed even, because that's no longer an issue. So that's an important one. The second thing was the coming of digital cameras and medium. So one of the famous cases that's very well known in the West is Jafar Panahi's film. He was banned from making any films for 20 years. He was under house arrest for 6 years, and yet he used his camera to make a film, to talk about a film, because he wasn't even allowed to write a screenplay. And he reads out his screenplay within the confines of his apartment, and the joke is that he puts it on a USB key, bakes it, and puts it in a cake, and then sends it to Cannes. Now, that means that regardless of whatever restrictions there are on making films, you can then get it out. But it's not as easy as that either. I'm not sure if that film wasn't made by Jafar Panahi, whether or not anybody would have given it a second look. It's also it's who he was, and therefore the kind of capital he was already using to present his work. If you are someone who doesn't have any of these backings, I think there are a number of different avenues in Iran itself that can enable you to start working on your films. So I've come across one of these private schools that brings in famous filmmakers and gives young filmmakers the opportunity to be trained with these so-called masters, to go back to your question of masterpieces and masters, and whether, and these would be, like Asghar Farhadi and some of the well-known directors who teach there. And the use of digital media, whereas before you really needed to get the state permit to be able to have the equipment. The equipment would be very expensive. People were working within sanctions, which meant that access to material for 35 millimeters and whatever else was required was, access to those resources was very scarce. But now the digital medium has enabled that and provided some sort of ease. It's made it a bit easier for people to make films and either kind of have it underground or send it abroad. So I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Another? Yes.
Thank you, all of you, for a really fascinating day. I have a question for Mohammed Al-Assad. I want to ask you about Hassan Fathi. That he's very much a kind of lone voice in this kind of amazing, really picture that you painted for us. And is it the case that when he built New Gurna, that actually the inhabitants, the people who were living in New Gurna, as it were, then they didn't want to be there because it was kind of old-fashioned and so on. But it's really what is Hassan Fathi's legacy now that I'm interested in?
Well, regarding your question about why the villagers didn't live in, part of it was that they wanted something modern, which is interesting. But also it was related to economics. Many of them lived on looting tombs, and there weren't any tombs around where their village was located. So they left it. So part of it had nothing to do with the architecture. Hassan Fathi is a very interesting figure for me. I can give you a personal anecdote. our personal anecdotes. One colleague of mine who studied in Egypt during the 1960s and early 70s once told me that he's someone we sort of heard about but didn't know much about. He was very much marginalized. Then it was the publication of Architecture for the Poor in 1973 by the University of Chicago, and suddenly he rose to world fame. And then he was celebrated as the architect of almost the Islamic world. But again, I think that as we look now, he's sort of faded away again. He's a very talented architect, but at the end of the day, he never really addressed the problems of urbanization, industrialization. It's one thing to build these beautiful works of architecture for 10, 20, 30 people, but now we need to house millions of people, literally. I mean, my city of Amman now is 4 million people. We need solutions for that. And another personal anecdote that I find very interesting, I taught at the University of Jordan from 93 to 2000. And when I first arrived, everyone was looking at, or the students were looking at Hassan Fathi, they were looking at Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, at Rasim Badran. When I left at 2000, they had forgotten about them. All of them were looking at Hadid, at the masters of deconstructivism, Gehry, etc. At this stage, he's been actually forgotten again. What will happen in the future, I do not know. But really now, he's sort of back in the background. I mean, people still say he's an important architect, but I see very few architects or students of architecture who are looking at his work. It's not a very encouraging statement, but yeah.
Some more questions? Do we see one here?
Which brings me to the next question, also for Mohammed Al-Assad. So you mentioned Gehry, and yesterday Her Excellency mentioned quite a number of buildings that star architects are building in Doha and in the Emirates. But also we can go back to an earlier moment in which, for example, Paolo Portoghesi built the mosque, the main mosque in Rome. So in your talk, you haven't addressed the other way around of architects that come from a non-Muslim background, but they are now working very often in Muslim countries. So can you comment on that?
Well, sure. I mean, the first professional architects were Westerners. As I mentioned, Julius Franz and August Jachmund and so on. And many of them left a very strong legacy in the Islamic world, whether in Turkey, in Egypt, and they had students, they had a following, and I think they had a very strong impact on that. And you have, here I might digress a bit, there's a very interesting moment in Iraqi architecture that many people do not know about. Iraq was discovering oil. It was becoming a relatively rich country around in the mid-1950s. And you had a number of young architects, such as Rifat Shadrji, and they were rather annoyed because the government was hiring sort of second-rate British architects. And so, but they were all well connected. So the Minister of Public Works calls them and says, you're all complaining, you're making a big fuss. What do you want me to do? And they said, here is a list of the great architects of the world today. Invite them. And he did, actually. And so you had Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, Alvar Aalto. The great names of architecture in the world, actually, all came to Baghdad. And it was a moment that had not been seen in any city in the world. These masters of modernism coming to Baghdad all at once. And it was a truly remarkable moment. So we sometimes forget, I think I talked with Nada about that yesterday. Nothing is one way. Things are going sort of in both ways. Professor Neil Levine at Harvard wrote a wonderful book about Frank Lloyd Wright. And he said, actually, for Frank Lloyd Wright, designing in Baghdad was a dream come true. As a child, he was fascinated by Alauddin, the Aladdin stories. And he always felt that he was an Aladdin, that he was this, ordinary young kid who had a magical ability, architecture. And then suddenly, Iraq invites him and says, design our opera house. So we actually have now we think of all these architects coming and designing in the Arab world. But in fact, we have a long history of that from the 19th century, of these great architects, and sometimes not so great but competent architects coming in. And don't forget also, Iran has produced a large number of architects who are very influential in academia in the West. I was talking to someone yesterday. There's the Lebanese mafia that now runs a number of American universities, the departments of architecture. So really we have had tremendous amount of interaction between architects from various parts of the Islamic world and the West, going back and forth in both directions. That's probably a separate subject that's worth pursuing. I hope I've answered your question.
Someone else? Very hard to see.
Good afternoon. My name is Khadimul Haq. The question I was going to ask has been answered already, but still I took the microphone to just to share some little thoughts provoked this morning by the presentations of Her Royal Highness Wisdom Al-Hashimi's presentations. I'm from Bangladesh, a predominantly Muslim country where I work for the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Dhaka. But one of my favorite area of interest is the modern and contemporary art of Bangladesh. Very often, I have to deal with the question, what the hell is the relation to Islamic art with what you work for? I used to answer those with my own logics, and now the logics are more stronger, it seems. So thank you very much for the eye-opening presentation, and also Nada for the answers. And just a single note, both Wisdom and Dr. Al-Assad referred to the beautiful mosque of Dhaka, the Baitul Rauf. And Dr. Assad showed that the modern elements on it, but I just like to add a little bit that it's also full of reflections of the past. I like very much Marina's work because the very technique of intricate brickwork was a common phenomena in the medieval mosque architecture of Bengal. And I thought Marina has done a beautiful, wonderful thing to just make a modern mosque out of, based on past experiences. Thank you very much.
May I say something?
Yes, sure.
You're actually absolutely right in that you can always connect to the past not through copying of forms, but through capturing the spirit of the past. And I think she's done a wonderful job of capturing traditional techniques in terms of the use of brick. So I actually stand corrected there. But there was something I wanted to say, but I didn't want to go over my 45 minutes about Marina's mosque. Now we have the time, or sort of. Her family is the patron of the mosque, and they want to build an extension to the mosque. And so she met with the local community. I don't know if you know the story, and she asked them, what would you like me to do? And they said, we love the mosque. It's a wonderful mosque. We really love it. But for the extension, please put a minaret. So actually, at the end of the day, there are many of us who still want familiarity and identity through the past. So even though this is a celebrated building, it won the Aga Khan Award. Many consider it one of the greatest, works of contemporary architecture in the Islamic world. But the local community wants a minaret added to it. And something interesting also, of the 6 winners of the Aga Khan Award this last cycle, 2 are from Bangladesh, actually. Yeah.
I'm going to say something because you mentioned something very interesting, and you talked about where you work, which is, Islamic, you said heritage. I'm sorry if I forgot the exact title, but this is one of the problematic with the notion of the Islamic, right? That it doesn't differentiate between, let's say, the Arab world and the non-Arab world in terms of what does Islamic really means to them. I mean, some of us sort of try to base the definition of Islamic on aesthetics and hence differentiate, how the modern was completely unrelated because it wanted to sort of, sever ties, but how the contemporary has the option of reconnecting, because all of a sudden in the global world, the Arab world became part of the Islamic world as well, for various reasons, including political. So this is something that we should, kind of keep on the table as we talk about these definitions, that yes, we can't lump, none of the artists I talked about, for example, the Iraqi artists could be under the umbrella Islamic. Maybe some works can be under the umbrella Islamic, but not as a sort of an artist identity, nor the contemporary production of Iraqi art. However, there is a contemporary production that could be classified under, I don't know, just to borrow some of the terms that Hamid was saying, neo-Islamic or, contemporary Islamic in certain ways, because they do engage in what I call a co-presence situation, where it is connected to, let's say, 12th or 13th century, but contemporary at the same time, which is very different than the work that Wafa Bilal or even Shazia Sikandar does. So, I think we need to not necessarily continue, fully abandon these definitions and terms, but we need to understand them and not use them sort of the general way and apply everything to it. That's my 5 cents. Go ahead.
May I? Yes, something? I thought I was clear enough in my paper. I don't believe there is contemporary Islamic art, neither in visual arts, nor I'm not trespassing over Dr. Assad's domain, but in fine arts. What is Islamic art? What is it? I would like to know today what is, and I asked that question in my paper. Is it done, it is executed in a Muslim country, in an Islamic country, by the Islamic or a Muslim or an artist? What is it? If it has verses from the Quran, is that Islamic? No, it isn't. Because Islamic art, like we said, is related to the religion. The religion is being abused by Muslims and non-Muslims. That was when we were at the height of our, and until recently, I would say, until maybe the mid of last century, we were okay, or the 60s, 70s. But not anymore. Where is Islamic art? Who's teaching? What we are teaching as Islamic art is the art of miniatures, the art of geometry, blah, blah, etc. Okay? But contemporary and modern, they cannot, neither contemporary nor modern can be applied to Islamic art nowadays. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, you can go.
Can I just play devil's advocate?
This is what we're supposed to
do. Yes, good, okay. So if we look at the evolution of mosques, for example, I mean, we're not contesting a mosque as a religious edifice, an Islamic edifice, because it's a mosque where people will practice the religion of Islam. But we looked at examples that, use the language of the modern and contemporary in creating these buildings. Can we not necessarily, in certain ways, apply that to the visual world? I mean, I'm someone who wrote a whole book saying that there is no modern Islamic art. But I am now thinking maybe I was a bit, I spoke in haste. Or, there are certain periods that one can speak of the impossibility of such a notion. But I don't know. Maybe we need to reevaluate how we look at that. I mean, I don't have answers either. And I understand what Her Highness is saying, because the term has been used and abused, in where it doesn't apply. Like, for example, calling Wafa Bilal's work Islamic or Muna Khatum's work Islamic. How do we need to sort of, I think, have another workshop where we can sort of maybe find ways of understanding what do we mean by saying contemporary Islamic. Because, I mean, before I dismiss it, I know there are artists who operate from a base of faith. So how do we deny their production that connection, is to me problematic, although I don't have necessarily the solution, specifically for it. But I mean, it is such the contemporary age is as such that there can be many things that exist at once. It doesn't have to be one thing or another. And we see even within American art, there is some artists tell me, some of my students say that they create art based on their faith. And so if they're Christians, so that has a connection to their Christianity and their practice of that. Do we classify it? And maybe the problem is that we seem to want to label work that comes from the, and I use all these terms that I disagree with, but the Middle East, the Islamic world, and the Arab world, or so on. Do we feel that we must classify that, and in that classification declare them as others? Because even in the contemporary age, we seem to say that they're different than what is happening elsewhere in the contemporary age, which is a multiplicity of ideas and practices. So maybe the problem is that it can exist, but we just have not necessarily figured out the nuance of such a thing. And I say this, and my colleagues, my former students are surprised that I would even say such a thing. So, that took a lot of thought. I'm sure, there are people sitting here thinking, wow, she's changed her mind.
I just want to add, I would like to add one thing, is that instead of saying Islamic, let's say Arab art, let's say Indian art, let's say Pakistani art, subcontinent, whatever. It doesn't have to be Islamic. Really, there is no rule that any work of art that is done by a Muslim should be Islamic. It could be because it could be a Hindu who has executed, or a Druze, or a Christian. Even the calligraphic school, there were many, many Christian artists from Jordan, from Palestine, from Lebanon, who did execute calligraphic works. But it doesn't have, it could be Lebanese, it could be Arab, it could be not a Druze, not Islamic, not Christian. Why should we always hang onto a religion to be legitimate? And I think that is really playing on the emotions of the public when we do that.
I know there's one question way in the back.
Thank you. I completely agree with Nada, because what I see, and I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in the Gulf region for the last 20 years. So I've noticed, and particularly I work at VCU, so design school. I've noticed a sort of reawakening of amongst young people an interest in Islamic culture. There is, for sure, Islamic fashion that has been developing. And it's quite interesting. I mean, and it's incredibly progressive in many ways, in materials and designs and so forth. And there's a whole world of Islamic fashion out there, in fact. Now, when we come to things like the traditional visual arts, painting and printmaking, then I think, yes, a whole different sets of a whole different set of notions maybe applies. But I think where it really comes into play is the design area. And that really has kind of, young people have taken on the sort of idea of Islam to translate that in modern design. And so, yes, I think there is a multiplicity of these notions out there. So I agree. I agree with both Princess Wijdan and Nada, in a way that modern paint, photography, painters, they're not really. I mean, whether they're Muslims or not is neither here nor there. But there are areas where it matters, and where young people do put them found an identity in as Muslims in their work. That also exists. So I think you're both right, actually. Thank you.
Okay, I will. No.
You want
the fashion. Regarding the fashion, sir, I know what you mean by design, by Islamic design. Drop the hem, have long sleeves, cover the head, have few beads here and there, and that is new Islamic fashion. What is Islamic fashion? Even in the Quran, it doesn't say what a woman should wear and cover her head. It doesn't exist. Who created Islamic fashion? I don't know. Men. And men, exactly. And those men who created the Islamic costume, we want to call it, or whatever we want to call it, actually they did so because they didn't have enough confidence in themselves to keep their women to themselves. They didn't want anybody to look at them. But there isn't something called the Islamic design in fashion, in jewelry. So really, we are all these terms, I believe, are commercial terms. Even I've seen Saint Laurent headdresses for men. Mind you, they do exist. Saint Laurent hatta, what we call is the headdress. And the same for women, all the big, and now there are young fashion designers who are specializing in Islamic fashion, which I don't know how it came about, but let's call it fashion, money. Yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a good moment to stop on for today. And we're going to reconvene at 9:30 to 10 o'clock tomorrow is registration. 10, and we begin sharply at 10. I should also mention that at the Anderson Gallery at VCU, Wafa Bilal and Nusha Tavakolian are going to be talking about their work this afternoon from 5 to 9 or something?
At the gallery?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, 5 to 9. So if any of you are interested, please go down to the Anderson Gallery. Anything else? All right, well, we'll see you tomorrow. A big hand for all our speakers.